Brennan. Now to close the debate as a whole, we have Tom Harwood. Tom is a former chair of the student wing of Vote Leave and former presidential candidate for the National Union of Students. Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm very honoured to be speaking before everyone today. It's a nice surprise to get the invitation, but I'm really, really proud to be speaking for the motion that this side of the House is arguing for this evening. Actually, it's great to be at a debate where there are two sides, because it means even if I come second, I'll be doing a lot better than I did in the NUS presidential election, which is always a bonus. But that's probably enough about the NUS, because it's time to focus on substantive issues that actually matters to students. Thanks, guys. Tonight I'm going to discuss why this debate would be very, very different, and indeed was very, very different 6 or 7 years ago. I'm going to discuss why fees work well, why the evidence is overwhelmingly with this side of the House. I'm going to talk about how the proposition has tonight focused on peripheral issues, has tried to obfuscate their line, has tried to talk about other issues other than the actual fact that we'll be voting on this evening, which is simply tuition fees. And I'm going to lay out what this motion means. But first, just a tiny bit of rebuttal. Daniel Zeichner, you were talking about how business tax is going to save us all, right? That was the Labour manifesto's point, that you're going to whack up business rates and that's going to pay for the £11.5 billion it would take to get rid of tuition fees. Well, at a time that we are leaving the EU, and at a time that France will be lowering its business tax, when America will be lowering its business tax, what will happen to business in this country if we say we're going to charge you a hell of a lot more to operate in our country at a time when we're exiting a market? But beyond that, I'd like to get to my actual argument. Sorry, you can have a second. Go on then.
Just to point out that the draconian levels of taxation which Labour was suggesting, I don't know whether you can remember perhaps who was the Prime Minister when we had those draconian levels of taxation?
Sure, it was Margaret Thatcher.
And David Cameron, actually.
Well, both. Well, David Cameron lowered it, and as a result of lowering business tax, actually receipts went up, but that's a whole other story. In December 2010, a little-known Labour backbench MP from Islington North went on a television station that the Shadow Cabinet is really rather fond of these days. It's called Russia Today. He went on that station in December 2010 to talk about new proposals for tuition fees. He laid out 4 reasons why these proposals were terrible. He said it would mean fewer and fewer people going to university. He said it would mean end of access to education for people on low incomes. He said it would mean universities would become the preserve of the wealthy elite. And he said it would mean enormous damage would be done to the international standing of our universities. But he wasn't alone. In fact, the hard left of the Labour Party said much the same thing. The NUS said much the same thing. Left-wing pressure groups said much the same thing. But why am I bringing this up? Why mention 7 years old television interviews, 7 years old arguments, 6 years old arguments? Because they're not saying that now. And why aren't they saying it now? Because it's turned out to be wrong. The arguments of the Labour Party from that time have turned out to be wrong. And more than that, the exact opposite has happened in each of those cases. Far from fewer and fewer people going to university, more and more people are going to university. Entry rates for 18-year-olds are at an all-time high. More people are going to university than ever before. More poorer students are at university than ever before. The rate of increase for disadvantaged students is higher than the rate of increase for advantaged students. The biggest gains have been among ethnic minorities. Now, black students are twice as likely than in 2010 to attend the top institutions of this country. Go for it.
They're also 26% less likely to get a first or a 2-1. Should they get a discount?
Absolutely. Progress has been made, but not enough progress has been made. It's not perfect today. Clearly, it's not perfect today. There probably wouldn't be a debate if we lived in a world, we wouldn't need to have a union in this city if we lived in a world of peace and harmony and clouds and puppies and rainbows and unicorns. The fact of the matter is that we live in an imperfect world, but things are improving. And I hope that you'll agree with me that it's a good thing that gaps are closing, that more and more people are having opportunities. And yes, of course, we're nowhere near where we'd like to be as a society, but it's getting better. Not right now, not right now. What I did want to mention is that the only part of the country where the largest increase of acceptances into university is among the well-off, is Scotland. But we have talked a lot about Scotland this evening, so I'll probably leave the rest of it now. So Corbyn is right in a part that, a part of the UK is becoming more of a preserve of the elite, but that is the part that doesn't have tuition fees. In 2018, this is the final point he raised, the point about the international standing of our universities, which is one of the reasons that tuition fees were, of course, brought in the first place, to compete in a global marketplace, and it is a global marketplace. Well, the Times Higher Education World Ranking, it put 2 British universities in the top 2 places in the world. I won't say which one came first, because it might offend some people in this room. But the substantive point here, and someone mentioned international comparisons earlier in this debate, the substantive point is none of the top 10 universities in the world provide free tuition to their domestic citizens. None of the top 20 do, none of the top 25 do, none of the top 30 do. In fact, you have to get to number 34 before you find an institution in that rank that offers free tuition. And there's a reason. Because charging tuition fees, having that slight extra 9% on PAYE for graduates, means that universities can get the funding they need to deliver for students. But the proposition are making different arguments to 2010, because the facts are now remarkably on our side of the house. It's really quite interesting that this opposition have talked about, the proposition rather, have talked about system overhaul. They've talked about early years education. They've talked about maintenance loans. Practically the only thing they haven't talked about is tuition fees, which I expect is what we all turned up to hear about today. But if the facts are so clear, why is this even an issue? Why is this so hot button? Why are we still discussing it? I think it's down to a failure to communicate. I mean, there were abject failures in the first few years of coalition government where people were easily rode over with the terms debt, with the idea that we're burdened, when actually it's not a debt at all. It's only paid over £21 and soon to be £25,000 when you're earning, which is going to be above the average wage. You will only be paying back a debt when you're earning more than the average person earns in this country. I think that's quite a salient point to remember. But more than that, it comes out of PAYE. It's wiped off in 30 years, and graduates are simply taxed 29% as opposed to 20%. But moving that to one side, lots on the left agreed with this system until it became convenient for them to oppose it. We saw a note published on the NUS website in 2010 calling the new system relatively progressive. That note was swiftly deleted and an uproar ensued. Angela Rayner allegedly pushed for this policy not to be in the Labour Party manifesto. She was advocating early years as something that would be a more timely, a more progressive policy to pursue for £11.5 billion. Andy Burnham this year at Labour Party conference says that Labour needs to move away from the current policy it has on tuition fees because it's regressive. The proposition has made an emotional case tonight. It sounds nice, but under inspection it just falls apart. It's telling that opposition parties usually oppose tuition fees, and when they're in government, they usually introduce or up them. I mean, the Labour Party opposed fees and then introduced them. The Conservatives opposed fees when they were introduced and then trebled them. And the Lib Dems, I don't even need to go there. But there's a pattern, and that pattern is simply because the evidence is overwhelming. And it might sound at first unenviable to be a student and to come here and advocate this case on this side of the house. But as I said, I couldn't be happier to do so, because this system is providing the greatest gains for the most disadvantaged in our society. And that's a wonderful thing, and we shouldn't shy away from it, and we shouldn't ignore it. And yes, there are problems. Of course there are problems. Under any system there are problems. But my God, are those problems getting smaller day by day? This debate, at the end of the day, is about tuition fees. If this debate was about maintenance or early years, I might very well cross the house and speak for you guys' side, because living costs are clearly the biggest issue that students face today. Housing is clearly a huge issue that was mentioned earlier. But if you focused your impressive energies on fighting for those things rather than wasting time tonight talking about a system that's actually delivering for students, maybe we'd see some of the advances that we need in terms of access and in terms of attainment for disadvantaged people in our society. It's frustrating to be ignoring evidence. It's frustrating to listen to zealotry rather than fact. 7 years ago, the proposition provided a very different argument to the one that we're hearing today. The more that time goes on, the more facts vindicate this side of the House. The Labour election pledge was simply headline grabbing. 11.5 billion pounds could have reversed all of the welfare cuts. All of the welfare cuts from the last parliament could have been reversed with that amount of money, but it was a political choice not to do so. And it was a political choice that played off very well in terms of silly political games, but it's not one that will help the most disadvantaged people in our society. And so I'll just end by asking that this House consider our priorities. Voting for this side of the House this evening is not endorsing this government. It's not agreeing to this government's policy on living costs or interest rates or, bizarrely, housing, as was mentioned earlier. Those things are not tied to what we're voting on tonight. All our argument is that the current funding system enables universities to stay at the top of the table and opens them up to the most disadvantaged. Voting for the opposition means that you believe that the best way to spend £11.5 billion is not on those most advantaged graduates, but is in other areas, is in helping other people, probably the people that need the most help. The proposition's case is expensive, it's unfair, and it does nothing to solve the real issues in higher education. Please, tonight, side with the evidence and not the ideologues. Thank you.